A red and white car crosses the line at the Hungaroring, and for the first time in almost a year, the timing screen tells a completely different story than the one everyone expected to see. Lewis Hamilton is on top. Not by luck, not on a fresh set of tires while everyone else nursed old rubber, on a set that had already done 6 laps, in conditions nobody in the paddock was calling easy. He found something that put him ahead of his own teammate. And his own teammate, on this same weekend, 1 year ago, was the reason people started asking whether Lewis Hamilton even belonged at Ferrari anymore. You need to understand what that sentence actually means before you understand why today matters. Go back 12 months, same track, same gravel traps, same city of Budapest sitting outside the gates of the circuit. Lewis Hamilton walked out of qualifying that weekend and called himself useless. Not frustrated, not disappointed, useless. He suggested out loud in front of cameras that Ferrari should consider changing the driver. Think about what it takes for a 7-time world champion to say that about himself, on record, with his own team standing right there listening. That is the moment everyone remembers. What almost nobody replays is what came after it. Fred Vasseur did not distance himself. He did not let the story run on its own. He sat in front of the same cameras and said something that, at the time, sounded like a team boss doing damage control. He said Hamilton was frustrated but not demotivated, and he called those two things a completely different story. Then he went further. He said the demanding side of Hamilton, the side that had just called itself useless, was not a weakness. He said it was the reason the man is a 7-time champion in the first place. Demanding with the team, demanding with the car, demanding with the engineers, the mechanics, and with Vasseur himself. But first, he said, demanding with himself before anyone else. At the time, that quote read like loyalty, like a boss protecting a struggling signing because walking it back publicly would have been worse. Nobody was treating it as a prediction. Here's the pattern nobody was naming back then. When a team principal defends a driver in public, there are usually 2 readings available. The cynical one says he had no choice. You don't throw away your highest profile signing in his first difficult season, no matter what he says about himself in front of a microphone. The other reading is rarer, and it only becomes visible in hindsight. Sometimes the team boss actually believes what he's saying, and he's not talking about the driver's mood. He's talking about what that mood produces once it points in the right direction. You cannot know which version is true in the moment. You can only know it later, when the data either backs the story or buries it. Today, at the exact same circuit, the data showed up. Ferrari didn't just have one competitive car in second practice, they locked out the top 2 positions entirely. Charles Leclerc had set the pace in the opening session by close to half a second, a clear marker that the car itself had real pace at a track that traditionally punishes anything without a strong front end. Then, in the session that actually resembles qualifying and race conditions, Hamilton turned it around. He beat his teammate by just over a tenth of a second, and he did it on tires that were not even fresh. Lando Norris came home 3rd for McLaren, roughly half a second off the pace. That gap matters. It's not a photo finish. It's a statement. And around that Ferrari 1-2, the rest of the grid was falling apart in ways that made the contrast even sharper. George Russell got on the radio and told his own team the car felt, in his words, dreadful. That it was so out of balance he could barely trust it through the corners. Pierre Gasly reported that something felt wrong with his Alpine before climbing back through the order. Isaac Hadjar had a big lockup and ran off at turn 1. Fernando Alonso had a moment of his own holding the car together. Kimi Antonelli, the championship leader, came on the radio sounding almost stunned, asking what on earth was going on after nearly spinning twice under braking. Max Verstappen, usually the driver least likely to complain publicly about his machinery, said flatly that he wasn't sitting in the car properly, that it felt terrible, and then reported what he suspected was debris damage to his front wing. This is the part where the interrogation starts because none of this happened in isolation. Ask yourself why. On a weekend where half the grid is openly struggling to keep their cars pointed in the right direction, one team produced the 2 fastest laps of the day with room to spare. Ask yourself why the driver at the center of last year's most public crisis of confidence is the one who ended up on top, not his teammate, not the 2-time defending frontrunners at McLaren, not the reigning power at Red Bull. Ask yourself what it says about a team principal's read on a driver when the exact quality he defended, the relentless, demanding, occasionally self-destructive standard Hamilton holds himself to, turns out to be the same quality producing the fastest lap on the board a year later. None of this is a coincidence dressed up as destiny. It's simpler and colder than that. A team principal made a bet in public at a moment when it would have been easier to say nothing. He bet that the version of Hamilton who calls himself useless is the same version who finds a tenth of a second nobody else can find. Those are not two different drivers. They are the same competitive instinct pointed in opposite directions depending on whether the car is behind him or under him. Here's what that really means for the rest of this weekend, and for the teams that now have to answer it. If your McLaren half a second down on a Friday afternoon is not a disaster, but it's not nothing either. It's the kind of gap that a team spends the rest of the weekend trying to explain away in the debrief room. If you're Red Bull, you have a driver telling you the car is terrible, while a car damaged by possible debris sits waiting for inspection. And that's not a small technical footnote. That's a session where you leave with more questions than answers, heading into a track that has rarely been kind to you anyway. If you're Mercedes, you have your lead driver using the word dreadful on an open radio channel about a car that was supposed to be closing the gap, not opening it again. And if you're Ferrari, you have the driver everyone was ready to write off 12 months ago sitting on top of the times at the same circuit with the same team principal who backed him in public when backing him, looked like the harder, less obvious choice. That's the raid, not luck, not a fluke lap on a quiet Friday. A pattern that started with a defense nobody fully believed and is now being written in lap times nobody can argue with. The story isn't over. Practice times on a Friday have a way of humbling people by Sunday, and Ferrari knows that better than most teams on the grid because they've been burned by strong Fridays before. But right now, at this exact moment, the loudest thing on this track isn't a lap time. It's the quiet vindication of a team boss who chose to defend a demanding, self-critical champion instead of quietly moving on from him. That's the game behind the game, not who's fastest today, who bet correctly a year ago when nobody else was willing to. Before you go, if this kind of read on what's really happening behind the paddock walls is the reason you keep coming back, make sure you're subscribed, because this channel lives and dies on catching these moments before anyone else connects them. Drop a comment and tell me if you think this is the start of a real turnaround for Hamilton at Ferrari, or if you think Saturday tells a completely different story once real pace comes into it. If this breakdown gave you something to think about, share it with someone who's still writing Hamilton off at Ferrari, because right now that red might already be out of date. And hit that notification bell, because the moment qualifying happens at this track, we'll be right back here pulling apart what it actually means. So, was this a genuine changing of the guard at Ferrari? Or is a Friday afternoon in Budapest about to get humbled by Saturday reality? Let me know what you think below. Until the next one.